Welcome, everybody. This is going to be a little bit different because we are without Jeremy this month. Jeremy is at the European SharePoint Conference in Prague. So I am attempting to fill his shoes. So we have some interesting material here today to share. Let's just go through our usual notes of our next call. If I did the calculations correctly, should be January 7th. And this is a session, this is a presentation where you get to find out how Microsoft Graph teams work and what they're doing, and get a whole bunch of information about the work that we're working on. Today's agenda, I will introduce the presenters, and then we're going to go through a few experiments that we've been doing to make the new Graph Explorer preview even better, and we would love your feedback on those things. And then for the most of the call today, we're going to talk about Microsoft Graph PowerShell SDK. At Ignite, we announced a preview of the PowerShell SDK. It is still very much in preview, and we're doing this specifically so that we can get your feedback. I am going to do a short introduction to the SDK, how to get it installed and how to start working with it. And then we're going to get some great feedback from Todd Klindt, who has been playing around with it. And he's going to tell us what he likes and what he doesn't like. And I hope that if you have also had a chance to play around with it, that you can post some comments in the chat window. And we're always looking for feedback on our GitHub repo, and we'll share all of these links as we go along. And then we're going to end up, I'm going to talk about the roadmap for the PowerShell SDK and what the timeline that we expect to be able to try and release to GA. And I'm going to end up with a little bit of behind the scenes, how we make these things work, and how we're producing the PowerShell SDKs, and potentially ways that you could contribute. So, and with that, my name is Darrel Miller. There's my Twitter handle. Talking about the Graph Explorer experiments, we have Japheth Obala, who is from a team of devs that we work with in Nairobi. So he's joining us late in the evening in Nairobi at the moment. And of course, I mentioned Todd. So let's get started, and let's talk about the Graph Explorer experiments.
Yes, I've been working on a number of experiments regarding providing a better view for customers to see the JSON response in the response view. So the first experiment is having a resizable window. In this experiment, this isn't. You can use your imagination there, but just to give you a sense of how it will feel like, having the user drag the response view to increase its height so that they have more real estate to read the response. This doesn't make sense for this size of response, but if I click on, say, get mail, my mail, you'll see that there is a lot of information there. So more screen real estate makes sense. The second experiment regarding this is the expand window, which is like a full screen functionality. I'm switching branches in another screen, so this will reload in a moment. So there you go. So if I click on my mail and then you click this nice little icon here, see it pops into a model, and then you have more screen real estate to do whatever you want, or rather for easy reading of the response. So what I'm requesting is feedback from the community regarding which of these two makes sense the most and is easier to use. And the third experiment that I have been working on is an alternate view for the JSON response, which I also like feedback on whether it makes sense to push it to prod or it doesn't. So I'm going to switch branches again to the third experiment.
And just to be clear for the folks watching, this is not an either or type of option. If people think we need both options, all three options, or alternative options, please don't hesitate to give us feedback as to the directions. We don't want to clutter things with things that people aren't going to use, but if people think all the different features are going to be valuable, then let us know.
Yeah, thanks, Darrel. So if I click on my mail here, so you have the JSON view, and then you also have visual JSON. Although I don't think visual really is the best part to use here, but anyway, it's an experiment, so open to feedback. Anyone wants a better name for it, then please contribute. So what this allows you is gives you, I'll say, a more interactive view where you can just click across and see the information that you need. Yeah, pretty much that's it. So this gives you, it's a slight improvement over the JSON response. Yeah, that's all.
It's good for us, those of us who are allergic to seeing curly braces and quotes everywhere, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's all from me.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Japheth. So please don't hesitate either to give us feedback here or on the GitHub repo. We are doing our best to try and make a lot of the work that we're doing public. All Graph Explorer work happens out on GitHub. So contribute, and maybe you will get whatever feature you want integrated into the next version of Graph Explorer.
Yes.
There we go. Excellent. So that was supposed to be the intro to your presentation, Japheth. And so, yes, and that was supposed to trigger me to mention, if you have not tried Graph Explorer Preview, if you visit Graph Explorer in its normal location, aka.ms/ge, or just go to the developer.microsoft.graph portal, there is a preview button on the older version of Graph Explorer, and you can just click the preview and it will take you to the new version. And again, all feedback on the features that are there are welcome. So PowerShell SDK, just to give a little bit of context, this is the definition of Microsoft Graph. Microsoft 365 data that describes the patterns of productivity in an organization accessed through a unified API endpoint. And that's really the critical thing. The value that Microsoft Graph brings is bringing this one consistent experience. So you're not working with a dozen different APIs and dealing with different authentication mechanisms and just having to learn different paradigms for doing effectively the same thing across all of the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. And while we've done that for the HTTP API, we still have not achieved that for those customers and those users who want to use PowerShell. So these are our efforts around trying to provide a unified PowerShell experience. And so I work in the developer experience team. I work on the SDKs. And so we already have infrastructure in place for generating SDKs across a number of different languages, C#, JavaScript, Java, PHP. And so that was the natural place for us to try and start to build a unified, consolidated PowerShell experience. And so that's what we are in the process of doing. So, and Martin, you're not allowed to call it a logo. It's an illustration. We have, yes, our beautiful new Microsoft Graph illustration. And bring us to our lovely Windows terminal for PowerShell. And I am going to do a little sneaky bit of setup that I was supposed to do before this event started. And I'm going to go into script. So I am in a clone of the MS Graph SDK PowerShell. I'll share a link to this in a moment. And we actually have a little script here that removes a service principal. And so the thing is, PowerShell is an application that works against Graph, so it has to be consented in the same way as any other application. So I'd previously been testing this and it already had consent, but that won't give you the experience. I want to be able to show you what your experience is going to be the first time that you come here and access the Microsoft Graph. So I'm going to open a new terminal, and the installation instructions are, if you go into the MS Graph PowerShell library, we have a set of samples here, and we have a full set of instructions, how to install a module and how to find commands and connect to Graph. And I'm going to try and avoid redemoing some of those things. So if you folks have already played with this stuff, it won't be too much duplication. But I encourage you to go and take a look at some of these examples that are here. within a short period of time, the entire install experience is going to be install module Microsoft.graph. And that is going to pull down all the modules that will allow you to access all of Microsoft 365 data. Now, we're not quite there yet. First of all, we are not exposing the V1 API. We are exposing the beta API. And this has a couple of benefits. One is it's a good reminder to you that this is very much a preview. But the other benefit is you get to play around with some of the new stuff that is being currently released. Now, again, this won't work because currently it is not deployed in the PowerShell gallery. We expect to have it in PowerShell gallery. We're hoping before Christmas. In the meanwhile, it is in another repository, and I'll show you instructions as to how to actually get that in a moment. I've already installed it because nobody wants to sit and watch me download the bytes over the wire. So really, if I want to actually get some information, I could literally just call get user and I want to just only see the ID and display name. And it gets IntelliSense there, and it's going to fail because it says, well, you need to connect to Graph. So we have a connect Graph command, just tends to be fairly consistent amongst the different PowerShell modules and similar to the way that it works in Azure. So we're going to connect to Graph here, and it worked, and it wasn't supposed to work. Let me just disconnect Graph. And I'm going to try and do connect Graph again. And this time, this is the experience that you're going to see, is we need to sign into Microsoft Graph. We need to go through a login sequence. And because this is a cross-platform solution, it's not quite so easy to get an interactive pop-up that works cross-platform. So it's easier to use this device code flow. But the way that this works is you just grab the token from over here, and you go to your favorite browser, and you go to microsoft.com/device login, and which was the link that was advertised in the terminal window, and you paste in that code, and now it allows you to sign in to whatever tenant that you want to access using the PowerShell. I'm going to sign in using this administrator, and it's going to ask me to consent. Now, by default, it asks for a very small number of permissions, which really won't let you do a whole lot. Like, it will give you access to your own profile, but it won't even give you access to other people's process. So if I try and do get user, it says I have insufficient privileges. So what we do is, if in these samples that we've provided, I have just a little connect graph command that has a whole bunch of permissions that are commonly used for different things. You can customize this to whatever permissions make sense for you. And if you look in the Microsoft Graph documentation, it tells you what permissions are required to do all the different kinds of operations. So let's just do this. And because I'm asking for a whole set of different scopes, I'm going to have to do the sign in dance again. So I'm going to grab that, go back and do the device login again. And it should be possible for us to actually come up with a proper UI flow so that you don't have to do the device code flow, but we just haven't quite got there yet. Now you can see in this consent flow is asking me for a whole lot more stuff. So now I'm going to be able to do things that are a little bit more interesting. So I'm going back to my terminal window. There we go. Let's clear the screen there. So now if I do get user and I say I only want select ID, comment description. Oh no, sorry, display name. Now I'm going to see all of the people that are in my particular tenant. And I can do basically the same thing for a set of groups, get group. But remember, PowerShell doesn't use plurals. I try to do get groups all the time, and no, whether you're getting a single item or whether you're getting a list, you use a singular. So ID, display name, say group types. Group. There we go. So we get a list of information with regards to groups. And you can get the idea of like the full set of capabilities that are available. You can actually go and find more commands by using the get command and saying I'm interested in the modules that are Microsoft.graph.beta star, and I don't know. Let's look at things like one thing that we just recently changed, and you'll see some of the challenges that we run into. If I do delta, you'll see down here in this 0.1.1 module, we used to generate these modules and they all said invoke delta user calendar view. You have to understand that we generate all of these automatically and the naming gets created based on heuristics. And in this case, the heuristics kind of failed on us and it didn't do what it was supposed to do. So we recently just updated this module. So now we get something that's a little bit more natural. So you can say, go get me chat messages delta, go get me groups delta. Little bit of a letdown here is while you can go and get that initial delta, we don't have a way of you actually being able to use that delta link. That's one of the things that will be coming up fairly soon. So that allows you to look for different things that are available. Here's one thing that is new in beta, and it isn't even in the documentation yet, get user presence. So you can now, if I go back and I do get user, actually I have, let's see if we can scroll all the way back up here. This is my user ID here. If I copy that and go and say get user ID, this user, it will tell me, oh, wait, no, I don't want to get user. I want to get user present. I am now currently away. If I go back over to this Teams thing over here, I don't actually look like I'm away. I look like I'm, oh, that's because I'm looking at, no, this is me. And I can set to do not disturb. And I can flip back over here. And it's going to say, yes, do not disturb. So that's one example of one of the new pieces of functionality that's available. It's brand new, and it's now available in the PowerShell modules. I want to show one other thing, because we're not just here in order to enable the interactive experience, but we also want to enable the scripting experience. So if I go into scripts here, there's a script that we've set up, and it allows you to get team members. This is a little script. I'll show you the script in a minute, but you'll just get a feel for what it does. Actually, I'm not going to run it like that. I'm going to run it like this. And it is going to go off and iterate through all the teams, find the owners of the teams, find the members of the teams. And if I'll just stop this for a moment and go back into our VS Code here and look in the scripts folder, we'll take a look at this PowerShell command here, or this PowerShell script. You can see that I'm using a different form of the connect graph. And if I hover over this, you'll see we have all the appropriate help. So you can see there's different overloads to the connect graph. You can just pass it the dash scopes, and you will sign in using delegated flow. But if you want to be able to do an unattended type of action where you don't want somebody to go through a sign in, then you can use app only access to the graph. And in order to do that, you need to create your own client ID, and you need to use a certificate at the moment. We will be working on supporting managed identity also for a lot of people who want to are used to using the Azure managed identities for doing PowerShell work. And we currently accept certificate name and a certificate thumbprint as a way of identifying those certificates. The certificate thumbprint was something new that came out yesterday. So once we have a client ID and tenant ID and we identify the certificate we want to use to authenticate, then we can run this script unattended, and it will go and do whatever our bidding happens to be. So that gives you a brief overview, and so that I don't steal too much time from Todd, I'm going to leave it there, and we're going to hand over to Todd, and he's going to give us a bunch of his feedback from him playing around, and then we'll talk about where we're going to go from here. So Todd, would you like to share your screen?
Sure. So I am Todd Klindt. I'm a SharePoint MVP for 100 years, and I came at this from a different angle. So I am not much a graph person, but I'm an administrator. I've been administrating SharePoint, and then when the cloud revolution came, I made fun of it and mocked it because I love my on-prem servers. And then I wised up and realized that the cloud is the way to go. So when Darrel and Jeremy first started looking at this, I've known Jeremy for a long time, and he thought that it would be good to get the admin take on how this has been working. So I've been working with the team a little bit, giving them some of my feedback, trying to be understanding and respectful and all that, because I am really excited about this. I'm gonna mention some stuff that I don't like, and it's gonna sound like I'm fussy and angry, but in reality, I was really excited when I first heard about this. This was the answer to a lot of my questions. So I recognize a lot of names in the chat here, in the participants, and you guys are mostly graph folks, not admins. So when I give my feedback and the things that I'm going to talk about, it's very much for the users of the PowerShell and users of the graph. So take that with a grain of salt when we mention stuff. Darrel brought up an interesting point about the scopes. Throughout for the last couple of years, when the graph first came out, it was like, the answer to all my prayers, all my user information is there, all my beloved SharePoint information is there. But getting into it for admins has just been horrendous. It's just been painful because I'm used to other kind of SharePoint modules, and getting into the graph has really been tough. And so the way that the connect graph commandlet works with being able to specify scopes has been really helpful. So I really applaud the team for that. And for my admin friends, I tell them to go to the permissions reference. So Darrel mentioned it a little bit, and I don't know if who's going to end up watching this. For you old-time graph folks, these probably old hat. But for us admins, we just don't understand the scopes. We're used to connecting as a user, having that user's permission, and the connect graph allowing us to specify the scopes has been really helpful. And then using that permission reference to map through, when I try to do something, the graph isn't really good at giving feedback on why you can't do something. And I understand that's a good security practice. If I'm a bad guy, I don't want, it's not good if I get feedback on exactly what I'm doing wrong. So it's got to be kind of vague. But as you're trying to talk about this PowerShell to some of your non-graph folks, your admins, make sure you give them that link to that permissions reference, because that's bailed me out a lot. And both Darrel and the other presenter whose name I've forgotten mentioned the Graph Explorer. When I've been playing with this PowerShell for the last couple of months, again, as a guy who's not really a graph guy, that Graph Explorer has been a great way for me to figure out what scopes I need and to kind of do proof of concepts for the PowerShell that I wanted to do. And so again, as you're evangelizing this to your admin friends, that permission reference in that Graph Explorer is very helpful. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention is you guys are looking at this, Jeff Snover, who is the godfather of PowerShell. There is none higher. He has moved over to the Office 365 team, and he's doing their AI bit. And at Ignite here last month, he did a quick little talk on an explanation of what the substrate in the graph is. And just the day before that, I've been talking to a friend of mine, and I said, I think I understand the graph, but there's that whole thing where if you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, you probably really don't understand it. And I couldn't have explained it to a 35-year-old. But Jeff's video on YouTube has been a really great video for explaining it. And I've passed that on a couple of times. You guys all understand the graph. You guys all understand the substrate. You're probably not the audience. But as you're trying to communicate with your coworkers, I've found that really helps tie the picture together. And I'll send all these links to Darrel, and he can send them out, or I can put them up or something. But that's been really helpful. The other thing is Darrel mentioned a little bit the samples, and I want to bring those up and kind of talk about those a little bit. He showed them in his file system, in his clone there. I have been spending a lot of time with these, and these are in the GitHub. It's the stuff that he showed. They've been updating him. This has been really helpful for me as a PowerShell guy. Now, one of the great things about PowerShell, Darrel mentioned it earlier, like the consistency, things like all of the nouns in the PowerShell command that should be singular, not plural. So it's get group, not get groups, things like that. And so that's really great. But unfortunately, what I found over the last 10 years of working with PowerShell is that not all the groups inside of Microsoft are PowerShell experts. So I come at PowerShell as a PowerShell user. Darrel comes to PowerShell from the graph side. The SharePoint team comes to PowerShell from the SharePoint side. They know their product. They don't know PowerShell as well. So while you have a good foundation for using PowerShell, every group does it just a little bit differently, and these samples are a great way to kind of get your head wrapped around. It's like learning, learning a dialect to a language. You already know the language, but the dialects are a little off. People drop their R's at the end, things like that. The samples are a great way to get up to speed on that. And the other thing that's been great is I've been giving Darrel and the team a lot of feedback from the PowerShell user side on how to make their commandlets more consistent with the rest of them that Microsoft are putting out. One of my major concerns was when the first set of these came out, and I've got these installed, if I do a get command, and I can just do the graph, oh, that's not what I meant. I meant get module. Yeah, I haven't get installed module. Anyway, there are a lot of graph modules where normally when I want to do SharePoint stuff, there is a SharePoint module. And when I want to do Azure AD, there is an Azure AD module. Well, that's not true. There's MSOL, and then there's the Azure AD and the other Azure. You get my point. With the graph stuff, there's a lot of modules to go through. And I don't want to exaggerate, but I think there's like 80, something like that. So this was one of the things, 86. So this is one of the things I brought back to Darrel was this is a bit overwhelming for PowerShell folks because we're used to seeing everything in one module. Now, this is a vestige of these being generated with AutoRest. So he and I have been discussing that. Azure RM already does this, and it's not great. They don't have 86, but they've got a lot. So this is one, if you're coming into this from the PowerShell side, this is going to seem a little overwhelming. The one that really got me was there's so many commandlets. So Darrel mentioned that you could do a get command and get the ones for from the graph. So I can do something like this. And I'm not going to do, well, I can do this, I guess, to show some. There are a lot of commands from the different modules. Now, I was talking to some friends about this, and I had them guess how many there were, and there are a lot. So for the entire module here, there are over 2,000 commandlets. And this gets tricky for PowerShell users because we do a lot of get command and looking for nouns and looking for verbs. When the list of potential commandlets is 2,000, that gets a little ugly. And one of my favorites examples of this is for OneDrive alone, or no, excuse me, OneNote alone, there are 700 commandlets. So by way of comparison, SharePoint Server, the on-prem product, for the entire product, there's 800 and some. So for OneNote alone. So that's another piece of the feedback that I gave Darrel and the team was we need to figure out some of that. Now, all of my feedback was given on an earlier version of the beta, and then Darrel tightened a bunch of these things up. So I look kind of silly talking about this now because they fixed them. But these are the kind of feedback that I've given them, and they've been really receptive. So I encourage you to go out to GitHub and give them that feedback. One of the pieces of feedback that I gave them was there is no prefix here. So one of the conventions that Microsoft has in its PowerShell manifesto that Jeff Snover put out whenever was that each module's nouns should have a prefix so that they're easy to figure out. And the great example and one that I bumped up against when I installed this is get group. So there is a command get group that comes from this module. And you can see over here, the source is here. The problem is groups are pretty ubiquitous. So obviously Active Directory has groups, SharePoint has groups, but it's all, get Azure AD group or get AD group. And the prefix on the noun is what makes it, stand out. But I had another piece of software called ShareGate that does some group stuff. They also had a function called getGroup, and I couldn't install these two on top of each other. They would clobber each other, and there's a lot of problems. And so I think I've talked to Darrel enough about that and whined and cried, and I think they're going to try to fix all that. But depending on which one of the betas you get, just know that there's not a prefix there to look at. So I don't want to whine entirely. So let me show a couple of things that I have used as an admin. So the get connect or the connect graph, like Darrel said, has been pretty easy. You can put the scopes in, you can put the certificate in. As an admin, as a PowerShell user, I find the scopes to be probably the easier way to do it because I don't understand all of the consent bits and I don't get all that. So it gives me that. I can go to that page. I'm showing off the old Edge dev branch here. So here's my code. And this is important because for a lot of us PowerShell folks that aren't Graph folks, we don't want to do all the things about creating the applications. And for most end users, that's too much. So I really like that the team did this and made the ability to connect again with more scopes if I find out I don't have the permissions that I need. One of the things, another thing I wanted to pitch was at Ignite, Darrel did a theater session, and all of the Ignite sessions are online for free. So I wanted to give a shout out to that because he did a really good session on that, did some other some samples and stuff. So that session THR 3095. You can see the session number right there. It's got a video and all that. He shows some of these things. I've learned a lot from watching that. I was in the audience. I heckled appropriately. Didn't rattle him at all. I was a little disappointed. But this kind of shows how things are created. It comes a little more from the developer side and the Graph side and the PowerShell side, but he does talk about that. But seeing all this has been helpful. So one of the things that we noticed there was if I do something. So I'm a SharePoint guy. I'm a PowerShell guy. So I do get command, and I want something around users. So I do something like this. Okay, that was a lot. So now I'm going to do verb get. All right, that's a lot also. So now I'm just going to pour through them. Okay, get user. That looks good. That looks like something that I want to look at. Get risky user. I think I'm just going to stay away from that one. I don't know what that's kind of scary. So I do get user. Now, when I teach PowerShell classes, this is kind of the path that I teach them on. I'm like, if you're trying to do something, do a get command, do a find, run the command. So I should have probably done this first. Do a help on it. So if you just type help with any of these commands, I think these are more of the vestiges of the commandlets being generated by auto-rest. So it's, some of the machine stuff. And a lot of the commandlets in the modules from Microsoft, these are entered by humans. So they're a little less scary than get entity from users by key. Hopefully some of this will get tightened up. But that's a good way to find out if it's the right command. And then the other thing I always do next is I run the examples. And right now there aren't any examples. There probably will be, but keep this whole get help-examples in your back pocket. So if I do the get user, I get this mess of stuff. So what has happened here is that these commandlets yet don't have default views for different object types. So what they're doing is they're just giving me all of the properties alphabetically and showing me what's there. So what I've had to do, and what Darrel shows in his thing there, is do a select statement, and I think he showed it in his demo, and show the things that we want. So if we do something like this, like I think he did, and then we get something that makes a little bit more sense. We can see the UPNs, we can see display names. For beginning folks, this gets a little scary. So what I've been telling the folks that I've showed this to is do something like this. Every object type has members, and if you pipe the output of something like get user, get group through get member, and only get the properties, then you can that's where I got these names right here. I can find out which properties that I want. And so if we do this, then we'll see this list about me, account enabled. That's all the output that we got when we just did the get user. So once they get this default view piece figured out, that will help. But the great news about this commandlet being generated by auto-rest is every crevice and corner of that object is available to us now. It's not like when the old commandlets like get Azure AD or get MSOL user. I've had those experiences where I know there's a property there, but it's just not exposed by that commandlet, and then I have to go talk to the team and see if they'll expose it, and there's reasons not to, and it gets very ugly. With this, every property is there, and it is just glorious because every nook, every cranny of whatever I want is there. I just have to find it. So that get member, properties member is the way that I've exposed those. So for those that are used to using get Azure AD user, this is like that. I should have piped that through more. So this gets me the object ID, the UPN, the display name. So now I can start looking at things. I'm used to seeing that object ID. That helps out there. So getting objects is usually where I start with PowerShell. I want to get users, get groups. Is kind of how I get my feet underneath me. But it's not a lot of fun if I can't create new things. Because my idea with this, and there was some chats in the chat room, and I don't have the questions up right now. is I want to replace all of my different modules with this. So somebody in the chat room asked about Azure AD. Will this supplant Azure AD and all of that? Maybe. I mean, that's more of a political thing probably than a technical thing. But my goal would be that, yeah, I would use the Graph PowerShell, and it would be how I manage my users in Azure AD. It would be how I manage my SharePoint. It would be how I manage my teams and my unified groups and all of that. And so part of that process is creating, new objects. So if I want to create a new user, that's another one of those, get help, all of that. But this one is going to be a new or add. And so this, I think I talked to Darrel a little bit about this at Ignite. For convention, and I can't remember how it is in Azure AD, if it's new Azure AD user or add, but new is normally for containers, like new group, and then add members to the group. So I don't know how these verbs will match out. But if I do a get noun user, then I can get that. And the other thing that I could do is I could take the asterisk off the end, and then it will just show me those. So now I look at new user, so it's the same deal. Again, since the stuff is auto-generated, it's a little ugly. That's a little tough. There's a lot to churn through there. And so when I was working with these, as I was working with these demos, I did this trick where everything in PowerShell auto tabs out. So the commandlets obviously auto tab out. I did that, but so do the parameters. So as I'm trying to sift through the hundreds of parameters here, I can just type P and start hitting tab and tabbing through them. The reason the parameters here, and I forget how many there are for this. This was maddening for me figuring this out. But the auto rest and the team has a tough assignment here. A lot of the back end of the graph is looking for objects. And objects are tough to pass in PowerShell. Totally possible, but PowerShell users are most used to putting in parameters that may or may not be objects. So it looks like they flattened some of these objects into individual parameters of the object. So figuring this out has been a little bit, a little art, a little science. But I was able to figure out how to create a new user. So I did that over here. And that's what that looks like. And again, there's no default view, so it just shot out that the account was enabled. And this is pretty simple stuff. So I gave it a display name, I gave it a UPN, account enabled, mail nickname, all of that. The password profile password, this one took me a while to figure out. There seems like a lot of instances of the word password here. And what I found is there are several parameters that start with password profile that are obviously a subset of a class or something. I don't know. I'm not a developer. But once I kind of started ignoring the whole password profile bit on some of these, then it made sense. And so now this user's been created. One of my frustrations with this is we can see like account enabled. That is a switch parameter. So I just put it in there. I don't have to put true or false or 1 or 0 or anything. But there's a couple of them that are not. And so one of them, for instance, was the change password at next sign in. So I did not put anything here. If I try to log in here as Jimmy, it's going to prompt me to change my password because I didn't put anything in there that says I shouldn't have to. And that's the wrong. I don't want to see feedback. So if I try to sign in here as my brand new created user, Jimmy, I'm going to put in the password that I put in here. And it's going to prompt me to do my password. Okay, so I don't want to do that. Let's say, for instance, for demos, whatever. So if I try to do this again with another user, I found that password change at login. And what I found was that was not consistent with being a switch. I had to put false at the end. So I bring this up as guidance when you're looking through the parameters of a command. There are the types behind. So like calendar ID is looking for a string. Some of these should be switches. Again, I've talked to Darrel a little bit about this, but as you're playing with these, if you just put the switch in and it doesn't work, then try it as a Boolean. If that doesn't work, try the colon at the end. That's kind of how I fought through that, but that did work. So I've created Jimmy there. And if I try to log in as Jimmy 2, it's not going to pop me for a password. You'll have to take my word for that. And then if I do, if I look here, it should, oh, that was deleting Jimmy, sorry. Sorry, Jimmy. So another piece that I've talked to, this brings me to my next demo. Another piece that I've talked to Darrel about is just how the pipeline works. And again, this is part of the thing where Darrel and the team putting this together, they come from the graph side and I come from the dumb PowerShell user side. There are a few places where I can't pass everything through the pipeline like I'd like to. Like with some of the previous versions of, or other modules of PowerShell, I could say, get SP site and then pipe that through, remove SP site, and it just removes them all. Whereas with some of these commandlets that are automatically generated, I have to loop them through for each to get that to work. And so I've been talking to Darrel about how to get some of those and help with that. Let's see, and that's pipe binding for pipeline stuff for all that. One of the things, so when I started playing with this, one of the ways that I learn any new PowerShell module or learn PowerShell in general is walking through things that I already know how to do. Because as you guys know, if you're any developers out there, when you're trying to develop anything, you're really fighting two fights at once. You're fighting the logic of doing the process, following through the process that you're trying to do, and then you're fighting the language in which you're trying to do the process. So I try to break that down because I'm not a developer. I can't do these things. So I try to take a process that I already know how to do, that I know the ins and outs of, and then try to wrap the language around it. And that kind of helps me get my feet beneath me. And one of the things that I always do is I tell companies, they shouldn't have groups that have only one owner, because then if that owner leaves the company, then you got nobody to man the group. And so I thought this would be a great way to use some PowerShell, the new PowerShell for that. So I kind of splunked around. We're running low on time, so I'm not going to walk you through the whole process. But what I did is, I did the get command, I did group. I'm going to pipe that through more because there's going to be a bunch of them. So I've got get group. I like that. But then I noticed again that I couldn't do some of the stuff, and Darrel talked about it, how they're broken out. So then I had to do another one, and I threw owner in there. And sure enough, there's get group owner. And so that got me the group owners that I wanted, but I did this just the same because it's kind of habit, even though there's not a lot of help out there. But this did help because now I know the parameter that's looking for is a ID. So it's not the group object, it's the ID of the object. So then that helped me kind of formulate what I wanted to do. So, and I guess the other thing that I did is before that, I did, because I'm a curious sort, so I wanted to know what types of groups we had out there. We're all aware that in Azure AD, we've got a million different kinds of groups, and so I was kind of curious how this API cracked those all out. It's interesting, Darrel and I are both using instances of the demo tenants that Microsoft have, so we've got a lot of the same objects in our tenant. For me, the only types of groups that showed up were unified. Darrel had some that were auto-generated, had some other ones, but I didn't. So I did find out from this that I could look on group types and I could get the unified groups, which were the Office 365 groups. So the other thing that I did just to show how to do this with an object, if I pipe, I keep screwing up my copy and paste here. That just populates the group list variable here. So I can do this command here that will give me all of my unified groups. I did it again. PowerShell 6 is not handling copy and paste the way I want. Oh, I did it. I forgot the select bit. So let's do that piece. Okay, so here are my unified groups. So I just did a where object, group type is unified, and then I selected the fields that I wanted. All of that. So now I want to do something where I want to walk through those and get the owners. So I did, just kind of pieced it through, did that. So that's piping it through. Again, I can't pipe it to get group owner because group owner doesn't take the pipeline thing. So I'm doing the for each and I'm doing that. I got the IDs, which is not great. Some of the samples and Darrel's thing at Ignite show how to resolve those to usernames. He's got a little for each loop that walks through. It's kind of genius. Not so worried about that because, well, heck, I've got it right here. I'll just show it to you. Because really, I'm not worried about the individuals that are group owners. I want to know how many there are. Oh, and I pulled that right out of his. I will leave that into the samples. So what I ended up doing though is I said, okay, I've got this list of groups, and I know that I can get the owners. I'm just going to count them. And so this was just a little thing that I ran that said, okay, I've got these groups. They don't have enough owners. And these are the ones that as an admin, I want to run this report, I want to do whatever. And I want to look through and I want to make sure that I've got 2 owners for executives. I've only got, I've got 1. So these are the kind of tasks that I do all the time that customers ask about all the time, and that I'm able to now quickly put some PowerShell together. And now I'm also be able to, loop in the groups piece and all of that. So I'm going to turn back to Darrel because I know he's got a couple of things to talk about. What I wanted to take away from this is with this PowerShell module, the graph has now become consumable for people who are not hardcore devs or hardcore identity folks. And it's really it's really opened things up for guys like me to get in and get work done with the graph. So I encourage you, if you've got people in your organization that are PowerShell folks and admins, to expose them to this and get Darrel and the team feedback. Darrel's team has been, I feel bad. I feel like I'm always picking on them because I'm always telling them what's wrong with their stuff. But it really is very exciting for me when I first heard about this. And the 2 months or so between when I heard about it, when I first got a hold of the beta, were excruciating. But this is really making the graph consumable for other people. And so I encourage you to look through it and help them make it as great as they can. I think that's all I've got. Darrel, do you want to take the helm back?
I certainly can. Thank you very much, Todd. That's been really awesome. It is really enlightening to see somebody else's perspective who spends their day-to-day life working with this stuff. So no, this is great. And I want to share a couple of things based on some of the feedback you give, and then we'll go straight into the roadmap and show a little of behind the scenes. So I'm going to share my desktop again. We managed to get a release out yesterday, and nothing like in the nick of time. If you now do get user, it does automatically provide a default set of properties. So get group will return these set of things. And what I hadn't actually picked up on, and I realized when you did the demo, is now it's going to be nice, is that when you create a new entity, it will reuse the same default set of properties. And I'll show you in a minute in the behind the scenes how we actually make this happen. So that was one of the items. The other item that you brought up was the prefix, and we have had an absolute ton of feedback on the prefix and the challenges that not having the prefix has brought up. And we've taken all that feedback, we've had conversations internally, and we have decided absolutely we are going to put a prefix. So fingers crossed, I'm hoping we will have that prefix available in our next release before Christmas. So, and the prefix is going to be MG. So we will have Azure with AZ, and we'll have Microsoft Graph with MG as the prefix. So it will end up becoming get MG user will be the way we do this. So that will hopefully resolve a lot of the issues that folks are having. I wanted to mention one other thing, and this is the whole pipe bind issue that you're talking about. And we definitely have work to do there. You can sort of do the pipelining by doing something like this. So here we're saying, go get me group members for a particular group. And then, yet we still have to do the for each, because we actually have to manufacture an object, because get user accepts an object, but it accepts it with the parameter name user ID. And the problem is when we are getting the list of group members, they come back with the parameter called ID. And maybe there's something that we can do about this, because we were just looking at the help for get group. And I'm going to do this like this. You will actually find that almost all of the objects have this overload, which takes an input object and uses this interface. So almost all of the commandlets I've seen do accept this pipelined object. The problem is we're using a sort of an incompatible property name on this, and maybe we can get that changed to be, for example, ID instead of group ID, so that you can actually pass groups into here and it will match, so you won't have to do that extra step of creating a temporary object to rename the parameters. So keep the feedback coming. We are not complaining in any way, shape, or form about getting feedback telling us the things that are broken. This is the whole purpose of us getting stuff out early as a preview so that we can get the feedback from you so that we do things the right way. And so I'm going to just go back to my deck for a moment. This is the roadmap. It is listed as milestones in the GitHub repo, and we will continue updating these with the issues that we are planning to complete for these steps on the roadmap. One of the first things that we want to do is get that prefix fixed, get out onto PowerShell Gallery. I did miss something. Let me just scroll back a few pages to this page. And just so that this is in the video, I mentioned before that we're currently not in the PowerShell gallery. We are in a slightly different, in an Azure Websites feed. So you need to do this register of the PS repository in order to be able to get the Graph PowerShell. All these instructions are in the GitHub repo in the samples folder there. But that's how you can currently install it today. But one of the problems with being in that private repo is it's much harder for people to find it. And we have another major disadvantage is that it means that we don't get, we can't get into Azure Cloud Shell. And we've been talking with the Azure Cloud Shell team, and they're going to work with us so that we can get this set of modules automatically loaded into Azure Cloud Shell. So when you launch an Azure Cloud Shell, you will get both the AZ commands that are all there already, and you'll be able to get the Microsoft Graph ones. So that's what we're hoping to get out for Christmas. Following that, we're going to go for a 0.2 release that will provide us with all these kind of cross-graph features. We've mentioned already about delta types. We have things, stuff that uses open types like SharePoint lists. So currently you can't get access to individual properties of a SharePoint list. Paging is something we can't yet deal with non-JSON responses, so dealing with photos doesn't work. Reports that have CSVs we still need to work on. Heterogeneous collections, you mentioned before about going and getting the owners of a group. They come back as a directory object, but in reality they are actually a user in many cases. So there's a bunch of scenarios that we want to get fixed that will affect all of the PowerShell commandlets across. And then we'll be working a lot more with the teams to make sure that we have all the appropriate functionality across all of the different workloads. And for those of you who will be joining us at MVP Summit, we'll be doing talks on that release candidate that's been timed for MVP Summit, because we like conference-driven development because it's very hard to move those dates. And then we're aiming for a 1.0 GA at Microsoft Build. So that's where we're trying to get to. And with the last couple of minutes, because I really only have a couple of minutes here, and I do talk about this in the Ignite deck. So if you want to hear me talk a little bit longer about this, go there. But we are generating this using the same tooling that Azure do with AutoRest. And in order to drive AutoRest, we need OpenAPI. And so we're actually taking the metadata from Graph, generating OpenAPI, feeding it into AutoRest. And then we are generating those modules, and we've layered it on top of Microsoft Graph.net SDK, which is also using the msal.net under the covers. And then we generate those libraries, and as I said, they're going to go out to PowerShell Gallery. This is a bunch of links to find various things. I want to jump right in the last minute to what I call these secret ingredients down here. And if we go to the repo and you go into the config file, there are two files here that are quite interesting. This first one is the list of modules that we are generating. And this is basically a regex that allows us to identify what pieces of Microsoft Graph go into these modules. Truly, the only reason that these things are split into multiple modules is just because the OpenAPI description of Graph is very large, and AutoRest can only handle up to a certain size. I have a feeling we can do a lot of improvement there. So I think in the future, we are going to be able to squeeze these into a lot smaller set of modules. So fingers crossed on that, but I think we should be able to get the module number down. And last but not least, I want to just show this autorest.config. This is how we fine-tune the autorest production process. Todd, you mentioned about inlining of parameters. Sometimes when we inline and there's circular references, we have problems, so we can turn off inlining. There's all kinds of, this is where all the formatting of the tables for the different models comes to set what the default properties that are shown here. And you'll find all other kinds of special queries and commands that say, oh, rename this to this, or oh, this verb isn't particularly good. Now, at the moment, this is all in a single file at top. We are going to be pushing this down, this config file, down into all of the individual modules. So there will be a config file for each of the modules that will have all of the customizations in order to get the absolute perfect experience. And with that, I am over time. So I'm just going to flip back to the deck and say thank you very much for everybody joining. And please don't forget to listen to the M365 Dev podcast with Jeremy and Paul. This is the best place to keep up to date. And as I mentioned at the beginning, our next call is on January 7th. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Dana.
No, I think we're good. Thanks everyone for joining. Again, next call January 7th. This URL is the correct one to download the new call series. It'll go from January through June. And then I also posted a link for a community call survey. It's just eka.ms/WAC community call survey. We'd love your feedback to make these calls better and more valuable for you guys. So thanks again for joining. Have a great holiday, and we'll see you in January.
Thanks, everybody.